Between 1943 and 45, dozens of German U-boats prowled the waters of Southeast Asia, preying on Allied shipping across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. In these distant, exotic parts of the globe, British, American and Dutch submarines would duel with German U-boats, whilst Italian and German submariners would mingle with Japanese servicemen whilst on shore leave in occupied Asia. This is the largely unknown story of Hitler's Far Eastern Fleet, known as the Monsoon Group. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that recently I travelled to Singapore and made a video about Sir Arthur Percival and the fall of Singapore. I was also lucky enough to visit Penang in Malaysia. Whilst on my travels, I took this book with me, Hitler's Grey Wolves by Lawrence Patterson. And the book describes the hidden history of the German U-boat war in the Far East. Incredibly, Penang served for a time as the main German U-boat base in that region. And today we're going to really drill into that and find out more. German U-boat crews would be based in Singapore, Penang, and also other ports in Indonesia. This largely forgotten chapter of the U-boat war saw German submarines operating from bases across Southeast Asia and establishing a sustained presence in what are now Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia. From these distant layers, they ranged across vast stretches of ocean, reaching as far as New Zealand, and hunting along the coasts of India, Australia and the Arabian Gulf. In this video, we're going to follow in the footsteps of those German submariners and visit two of the main ports that these crews operated from and hear their stories. This Far Eastern German U-boat force would be known as the Monsoon Group or Monsoon Group. Just so you're aware, going forward, any technical and complex German words that I came across in my research, I'm just going to use the English translation in my narration for this video. And it's simply because at school I never learnt German. I really don't want to butcher it. And I know if I do cock it all up, the pronunciation police will have a field day in the comments. So my apologies to any fluent German speakers, but yeah, I think it's probably the best course of action going forward. This video is definitely more of a one-off interest topic for me, and we'll be focusing on exploring the life of a German submariner in the region, more so rather than medals, which we usually focus on. So if you are a hardcore medals geek, you'll just have to forgive me for this one-off. The story of German U-boat operations in distant waters is often overlooked. We normally hear of technological exchanges between the Japanese and Germans, or the occasional German U-boat prowling in the South Atlantic or off the coast of South Africa. But few really grasp the scale and extent of what unfolded between 1943 and 1945 in the Far East. Although German U-boat activity in the Indian Ocean officially began in October 1942, these early patrols were not supported by permanent bases. Instead, submarines depended on risky mid-ocean rendezvous with supply U-boats, the so-called milk cows, and the U-boats were ultimately forced to return to occupied France for refit and maintenance after each mission. That situation, however, was about to change dramatically, with the Japanese entering the war and capturing key British and Dutch colonies in the Far East. In the latter half of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy began establishing bases in these occupied territories. Singapore and Penang would be of specific importance to the Japanese. The Royal Navy's dry dock facilities in Singapore would allow Japanese ships to be put in for longer repairs and maintenance. And the old British colonial colony of Penang strategically overlooked the Malacca Strait, as well as provided a springboard to the Indian Ocean. Penang would be ideally placed for Japanese forces to disrupt Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean. Prior to 1942, the German U-boat arm, under Karl Dönitz, dismissed operating in the Indian Ocean and beyond as a waste of resources when there were plenty of rich pickings closer to home. However, by early 1943, the Germans were losing the U-boat war in the North Atlantic. Needing time to regroup and establish a new strategy for the War of the Atlantic, Dönitz decided to permanently deploy U-boats to the Far East in order to open a new front against Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean, where Allied defences were believed to be weaker than in the Atlantic. A permanent presence also allowed the Kriegsmarine to operate from Japanese-controlled bases and sustain longer patrols without the constant need to return to Europe. For the Japanese, having German U-boat crews fighting in the Indian Ocean would allow them to reallocate resources to focus on the Pacific War. The U-boats deployed to the Far East would now be labelled as the Monsoon Group, and they would have three aims. Number 1, to disrupt Allied shipping primarily in the Indian Ocean. 2, divert Allied resources to the region away from the Atlantic. And number 3, increase cooperation with Japan and continue the exchange of raw materials for technology. In August 1943, the first German U-boat arrived for permanent station in Georgetown Harbour in Penang, after a journey of 153 days. The arrival of the vessel heralded nearly 2 years of U-boat operational presence in the Far East. U-178's task would be to operate as an advance party and establish the first German naval base in Georgetown. Wilhelm Dons, the captain of U-178, was a veteran of 11 war patrols and aged in his mid-30s. He would end up as the base commander in Georgetown, Penang, and by early 1945 was chief of all monsoon boats in the Far East. From then on, U-boats would be sent to the Far East in periodic batches to reinforce the Monsoon Group. The majority of these boats were the long-distance Type 9s, which were more fuel efficient and larger than typical U-boats that we used in the North Atlantic. Another submarine was also sent to the Far East around the same time as U-78, U-511, which was sent to the Japanese after they requested a German submarine to inspect and research to improve their own submarine force. The German crew members would train up the Japanese on the U-511 and then hand it over as a gift to the Japanese Imperial Navy, who would rename it as RO-500. The German sailors would then act as extra hands with the arrival of further boats from the planned monsoon fleet. Bound for Malaya, the first batch of 11 combat boats intended for the Monsoon Group left Europe in June 1943. It was planned that after their arrival, refit and resupply, they would begin combat operations in the Far East from September 1943. Only 5 of the 11 submarines arrived. This high attrition rate shows how dangerous the long journey could be. Leaving ports mainly in France, German crews would have to dodge Allied anti-submarine platforms in the Atlantic, as well as the South African coastline around the Cape of Good Hope. The huge distances would also make resupply and maintenance difficult, and therefore the commanders chosen to captain the large boats to Asia were older than average and combat veterans. It was thought these more experienced commanders would stand more of a chance of getting to their destinations. Subsequent batches of U-boats would be sent out from French ports over the coming months. They would generally be tasked with a war patrol in the Indian Ocean or South Atlantic before heading to the Far East. Some Italian submarines would also join in this, but operated mainly in transport roles. Both officers and men would be tested to the limit during such a long and monotonous voyage. In total, during the whole 43 to 45 period, approximately 40 U-boats would be sent to the Far East. Generally, on their way to Georgetown, they would be assigned combat operations either off the coast of South Africa or penetrating the Indian Ocean, intending to intercept merchantmen. Once they had completed that task, they would then proceed to Georgetown. During their journey, Type 14 boats, known as milk cows, would rendezvous with the combat submarines in order to provide them extra fuel, torpedoes, and other supplies. At the time, the overall German command structure within the Far East was a hodgepodge of stranded naval officers from surface raiders or other naval vessels. The flotilla was initially commanded from Georgetown, Penang, and then later in the war would move. There would be 4 bases in total, dotted around Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. 2 other minor administrative or supply bases would also be established in Japan by the end of the war. Georgetown would be the main HQ from mid-1943 until the end of 1944. German submariners would arrive heavily bearded and unsteady as they disembarked from their steel tubes which had been their home for many months. The majority of the submarines, after such a long journey, required significant periods of maintenance before they could then carry out further combat operations. Once captured and occupied by the Japanese, Penang would be used as a major naval and air base. The Swettenham Pier facility in Georgetown, although not a dry dock, was able to accommodate up to 5 U-boats at a time. Georgetown previously hosted Japanese submarine units after it was captured from the British, and the Japanese throughout 1942 and 43 built multiple workshops to service the submarines. The Japanese would build 26 sheds housing various workshops on the esplanade adjacent to Fort Cornwallis, providing over 300,000 square foot of machine shops and even a torpedo balancing station and other maintenance areas. This was linked to Swettenham Pier by railway tracks. As the Monsoon fleet began to arrive in late 1943, this area would largely be turned over by the Japanese to the Germans. Nowadays, the pier hosts cruise ships from all over the world. Regarding the workshops, due to a lack of skilled workers, German crewmen would have to do much of the work themselves, with parts shipped from Germany or replicas made locally, generally of poorer quality. Therefore, when not at sea, much of the German U-boatman's time would be spent conducting maintenance, something that civilian contractors would have done back in Europe. Within the palm-fringed streets of Penang, the Japanese provided fully equipped houses for the German crews. There were administrative offices, and enlisted accommodation was provided within the elegant Elysee Hotel. Officers were housed in requisitioned villas. The crews would have access to 3 cinemas and Chinese and Malaysian theatres. Although local strong alcoholic drinks like Arak were off limits, crews could consume beer. On rotation, crews would also get periods of R&R in the local colonial hill stations. One German crew member states, "Only a small number of our men could go on leave up to the beautiful resort, Penang Hill. With nearly unlimited freedom, they felt as if they were in paradise. Swimming pools, tennis courts, extensive gardens, and local cooks would be available." And the German logistics staff on shore would organise various nocturnal entertainment for the crew. Perhaps the most memorable recreation centre for many German submariners was the Shanghai Hotel. This is a German senior officer. "When the crew of U-861 got to Penang, I went to the Japanese admiral and said, 'I want a hotel for my boys.' And we were given the Shanghai Hotel, which had been requisitioned. So we started the hotel, and we engaged nice girls who were checked out by our own medical officers. We made contracts with these girls so that if they only wanted to dance, then okay, they got a certain kind of flower to wear. But if they were willing to do other stuff, then they wore a different type of flower as a signal. By taking this precaution, I succeeded in my aim in that none of my crew ever suffered from venereal diseases. There were some other boats that spent perhaps 2 months maybe in Jakarta or Surabaya, and half the boats caught nasties, basically. I won't say what it says here. The crew wandering into local brothels. That said, I'm sure the vast majority of sailors were checking out other sites such as this museum or safely tucked up in bed by 9 p.m. with a glass of warm cocoa and a good book. On the communication side, the Japanese maintained formal control over the main radio transmitting station, only letting Germans transmit communications at certain times. German crewmen also got a 10-page document explaining how to successfully interact with Japanese servicemen. Off duty, German servicemen would be allowed to dress in civilian clothes in Penang, and so to make themselves visible to the police, they would have to wear a yellow and white pin. Although relations between Germans and Japanese were generally cordial, problems could occur as both sides culturally were so distant. Many Japanese had been propagandized to believe that all Europeans were the enemies of Japan, and some Japanese could find it difficult to differentiate between Germans and other white men. An officer on U-219 recalled, "The Japanese were very keen on security. They were not so sure if these whites, i.e. the Germans, were the right partners for them. For example, they had an advertisement, a billboard, with a large picture of a big, round, blue eye, and under it the slogan, 'Watch for the eyes of the enemy.' So we approached them and said, 'But most of us have blue eyes too. You can't do that to us.' So they took them down, but immediately after we lost the war, the placards came back again." Otto Gies, I think that's how it's pronounced, the IWO aboard U-81 recalled, "The Japanese attitude to us was cautiously friendly. It was tolerant, occasionally arrogant, and loosened by liquor, it could become aggressive. How strange these people were, we thought. Intelligent, traditional, ceremonial, but cruel and dangerous at the same time." Bakeries were established to produce a German favourite, rye bread. Furthermore, a huge plantation was handed over to German authorities in order for them to grow fresh vegetables for the crews. A local German butchery plant was also established to provide fresh and canned meat. Eating from roadside stalls was forbidden for fear of contracting cholera or typhus. SS Nanking, a refrigerated supply ship, was a captured Allied vessel that was intercepted travelling from Australia to Burma by a German surface ship early on in the war. Within the ship's hold, it contained 42,000 cases of canned meat, 28,000 cases of fruit and vegetables, and 800 tons of flour, as well as fresh butter, meat and bacon. She would be used as the German Navy's primary storehouse in the port. Crews would also be allocated accommodation in other bases. A sailor recalls, "In Batavia or Jakarta, we had villas. The Japanese had taken over most of the accommodation, so we were allocated our area. We had one whole street for enlisted men and petty officers. The chiefs and officers lived in separate houses, mostly 2 or 3 to a house." U-boats were also sent to Singapore, renamed Shonan by the Japanese, for dry dock or more intense repair. However, the Japanese prioritised their boats, so the Germans had to hang around waiting for repairs. Turnaround time for a U-boat would typically be around 50 days all in all, to be ready for its next war patrol. In Singapore, Germans would be given accommodation along Gilstead Road and handed 3 large buildings for operations, including a radio transmitting station. In Singapore on one occasion, German crews would get into trouble for feeling pity for Allied POWs, who they saw being held in appalling conditions, malnourished and worked to the point of death. One German sailor recalled, "It caused problems with the Japanese on one occasion. Our crew, when they saw these British prisoners put to work by the Japanese, well, they gave them cigarettes and so on, which I don't think the Japanese liked. And then something else happened when one of our submariners was sitting on the pier in Singapore. A Japanese soldier came along with his gun, and he thought that the man was a prisoner of war, so he tried to attack him with his rifle, but the German was quicker than the Japanese soldier and threw him in the water. Later on, the Japanese apologised for this action, but things like that happened. The relations between us were a little reluctant up to a certain extent. There is no doubt, but the Japanese came aboard our boat once to visit, although all the work was done by our own people. We had no Japanese people working on it. On operations, malaria could run rampant, and at one point up to 25% of crews were affected. Dysentery also ran amok, no pun intended. Not great on a submarine that might have 2 toilets at max. When at sea in Asian waters, the rough weather, especially in monsoon season, would hamper the crew's ability to handle the boat. Tropical storms would add even more hardship, and within the submarine they would have to deal with oppressive heat, there being no air conditioning. Crew members on lookout or other duties on the casing would often go down with heat stroke or extreme sunburn. In the dank, humid conditions of the submarine, fresh food would expire quickly. Cockroaches and other exotic creepy crawlies coming on with the supplies would thrive in these conditions, and there would be regular outbreaks of these beasties on board. From their East Asian bases, the U-boats would patrol off the west coast of India, around Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the east coast of Africa, and the approaches to the Persian Gulf, intending to intercept Allied shipping. In the second half of 1944, German High Command would even decide to target the coastline of Australia and New Zealand, as we shall later see. As the war progressed, the Allies intensified their naval and air operations in the Indian Ocean, making it more dangerous for U-boats to operate. By 1944, the war in the Far East was decisively going in the Allies' direction, and by the second half of the year, Penang was coming under increasing threat from Allied forces who were by now able to concentrate large numbers of submarines outside Penang port to intercept naval traffic, as well as conduct long-range air bombing and mining missions from Burma and India. As an example, in one night in October 1944, 60 mines were laid in the approach channels by RAF Liberator bombers flying from Kharagpur in India. The Germans decided they would need to relocate their main operations further away and base themselves in Singapore and Batavia, or modern-day Jakarta. At the end of November, Batavia was officially designated the main combat base for the Kriegsmarine. In early 1945, operations were scaled back in Penang, and ports in the Dutch East Indies would primarily be used from now on for maintenance and equipping boats for sea. If you like this video, please consider supporting the channel on buying a copy of Class of Courage and learning more about an obscure medal as well as campaigns in British India, Persia and even this part of the world in the video Perak in Malaysia. The Amazon link is in the channel description. Of note, it's important to add that during this 43-45 time frame, a small handful of German and Italian submarines would visit Japan, either on supply runs, exchanging technology, or delivering boats to the Japanese. Incredibly, the crew of U-51 on arrival would even get 10 days leave at Mount Fuji. There, they would meet German women and children who were expats, living and working in the Dutch East Indies, and after the Japanese invasion, were transferred to the homeland of Japan by the Japanese. Interestingly, by the second half of 1944, the threat from Allied submarines for U-boats approaching ports of call such as Penang and Batavia had gotten so high that crews, as part of their standard operating procedure, would all wear life jackets, and as many sailors as possible would go up top on the casing when they approached a harbour. At this point, I just wanted to touch on the fate of some of the U-boats that operated in these waters. The majority of these submarines were sunk due to radio intercepts of Japanese or German messages of their intended departure and travel times, coupled with a lack of effective Japanese escorts. U-859 would initially be a lucky boat with 3 victories to her name whilst heading out to the Far East, including bagging a USS Liberty ship that was torpedoed off the coast of Oman, carrying millions of dollars worth of silver coins and bullion bound for Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union. However, U-859's luck would change in September 1944 when she was sunk by Royal Navy submarine HMS Trenchant that ambushed the U-boat as she departed from Penang. 20 men survived, 11 were picked up by the British and 9 later by the Japanese. The majority of survivors were back after the engine room personnel who donned escape gear and exited the boat after it settled on the shallow seabed. One crewman was literally saved by having diarrhea, being in the heads having a number 2 away from his post when the torpedo impact occurred. British sailors from Trenchant would rescue their German counterparts and bring them on board. Rescuing the German survivors, one British sailor recalled, "The German prisoners were very different from the Japanese. They were grateful for being rescued, and for them the war was over. We did not need to guard them like the Japanese, and they were divided, I guess on board the submarine, amongst the various messes according to rank. They were allowed a certain amount of freedom." UI-23 was an ex-Italian submarine requisitioned after Italy's surrender in 1943 and was composed of a cobbled-together German crew from various surface raiders and submarines. In February 1944, it was torpedoed on the surface by another British submarine, HMS Tally Ho, whilst approaching Penang. 14 men survived, rescued by seaplanes. The following boats were part of a plan by Dönitz to target Australia and New Zealand in late 1944. This would support Japanese operations in the Pacific Ocean. Out of the 5 U-boats sent, only 1 would break through and make it and survive. The first boat, U-196, had a mysterious end. A short while after leaving port, she radioed in a technical issue, and later would disappear with all hands in early December 1944. Her fate was unknown. U-168 had 3 victories to her name and damaged another ship on her various patrols. However, she was sunk by the Dutch submarine Zwaardvis in the Java Sea in October 1944. Some submariners were swept overboard in the blast as they were hit on the surface. Others, showing extraordinary coolness and courage, waited until the boat hit the bottom of the ocean floor at 45 metres. Gathering in the control room as the water level rose and allowed pressure to equalise, and then they opened the hatch with a resultant air bubble blowing them to the surface. 27 men survived. U-537 was also travelling in the Java Sea on the surface and zigzagging, but it was sunk by US submarine USS Flounder in October 1944, a rare occurrence of a US sub taking out a German U-boat. The Germans were taken completely by surprise due to the US weightless torpedoes, and there were no survivors. U-537's position was known for days because codebreakers in Australia had intercepted a Japanese naval ship's radio messaging concerning the submarine's intended departure time, route, and established times for passing landmarks. The final victim was U-183. Again, she was intercepted on the surface and sunk by the USS Besugo in the Java Sea. Only 1 crew member out of 55 survived. It seems pretty much that all 4 of these submarines' travel plans were intercepted by Allied codebreakers, who dispatched submarines to take out the German U-boats on the surface as they were transiting. Out of the original 5 Monsoon Group U-boats dispatched, only U-862 would evade Allied forces and break out into the wider ocean. She embarked on an incredible journey, patrolling the Southern Ocean, lurking off Tasmania, and prowling the waters around New Zealand. Over the course of this historic patrol, she sank 2 US ships before returning safely to port, one of the longest and most remarkable war patrols in U-boat history. U-862 truly deserves her own video. So was all this worth it? Figures are varied according to interpretation, but German U-boats sunk or damaged only around just under 140 ships. On the other hand, 41 German submarines left for Asia. Only 6 returned successfully. 24 transport missions were undertaken, and only 2 returned to Europe during the war. 4 others would arrive after the war, departing Asia whilst the war was still ongoing. The rest of the boats were either sunk or surrendered. In essence, the Monsoon fleet arrived too little, too late to have any meaningful impact on the course of the war. That said, I still find it incredible that whilst huge campaigns were ongoing on other fronts like D-Day, Market Garden, Iwo Jima or Bagration, German submariners were prowling this far corner of the world, perhaps socialising in bars with Japanese comrades, going down with malaria, or getting sunburnt while standing watch on the casing, whilst their comrades in other theatres suffered frostbite on the Eastern Front, for example, or struggled through mud and snow in the Ardennes forest. The hardship and danger of their campaign was largely overlooked or forgotten in the World War II history books. If you are into this obscure part of history, it's definitely worth checking out Patterson's Hitler's Grey Wolves. I've sourced much of the information for this video from this book, and it's also got lots of interesting photos in there as well of the period. If you like the travelogue nature almost of this video, you might enjoy, especially if you're a fan of the Sharp series, my video on arch-villain Obadiah Hakeswell. For some reason it only got a handful of views, but there I travelled to Badajoz, where the siege of Badajoz occurred, and Hakeswell was involved in the Sharp novels. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And a legendary YouTuber even makes a cameo in the video. If you're not interested in Sharp, all that sort of stuff, then please check out my video on here of Arthur Percival if you've not seen it before. Again, lots of shots of Singapore and all the action surrounding that. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.